walked upon this earth before the waters swallowed it whole, before the first raindrop fell from a sky that had never known rain, before the screaming began, before the world as it had been designed, shaped by sacred breath, ordered by divine intention, called good by the mouth that made the stars, disappeared beneath 40 days and 40 nights of absolute erasure. Something moved across the ancient land. Something that does not fit inside the categories we were taught. Something that modern theology has quietly pressed between pages no one reads aloud anymore. Something the ancient text refuses to hide, even as we keep trying to look away. They were called the Nephilim. And before we can understand the flood, before we can understand why a creator who once declared his creation good chose to unmake nearly all of it, we must look directly at what filled the earth in the years before 2348 BC. We must look without flinching. We must examine what archaeology, ancient literature, the oldest manuscripts of the known world, and the unedited text of the sacred record all point toward, together. Because the Nephilim were not a metaphor. They were not the symbolic product of bad men and worse choices. They were not poetic exaggeration invented by desert scribes trying to explain why some people were tall. They were not a literary device. They were the result of something that should never have happened. A breach in the boundary between two worlds. A transgression so severe that it did not merely corrupt individuals. It corrupted the architecture of life itself. It corrupted the seed. It rewrote the code of what a human being was supposed to be. And the Creator looked down at what had been done to his creation. And he grieved. That word matters. Hold it. We will return to it. The world before the flood is almost impossible to picture accurately. We carry inside us the assumption that ancient means primitive. Grass huts, crude tools, men who barely understood fire and spent their days afraid of weather. But the pre-Diluvian earth described across the oldest traditions of human civilization was not primitive. It was, by the consistent testimony of cultures that had no reason to coordinate their accounts, extraordinarily advanced. The Book of Enoch, one of the oldest Jewish religious texts, predating much of what we call the Old Testament in its written form, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and revered by the earliest communities of biblical scholarship, describes a civilization of enormous scope: cities, agriculture at industrial scale, metallurgy precise enough to produce weapons of war, astronomy sophisticated enough to read the movements of stars, music, architecture, systems of governance. The ancient record across multiple civilizations is consistent. The world before the flood was populated by human beings of considerable sophistication, which makes what happened to it more horrifying, not less. Because into this world, complex, populated, ancient in its traditions even then, something descended that did not belong, and what it produced by descending would corrupt everything that civilization had built, would saturate the earth with a violence so total and so normalized that future generations would struggle to believe it had been real. And so they turned it into legend. And legends eventually become the stories we call myths. And myths, eventually, are dismissed as imagination. But this was not imagination. The text calls them the B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of God. And the debate over what that phrase means has consumed theologians for centuries, often with more heat than light. Some traditions insist it refers to powerful human rulers, godlike men of political authority who took women by force, producing offspring of unusual strength and stature. Others, following the oldest Jewish interpretive tradition, the tradition that shaped how the ancient world itself understood this passage in its original context, read the phrase to mean something far more disturbing: heavenly beings, watchers. A class of divine creation that existed in the hierarchy between the Creator and mankind, assigned to observe the development of the world, who looked down from wherever they dwelled at the daughters of men, and chose to descend. They chose to cross a line that the structure of creation had drawn in absolute terms. According to the Book of Enoch, 200 of them made this choice. They were named, cataloged with the precision of a legal document. Their leader was identified as Shemihaza, and beneath him a council of lieutenants, each with their own area of knowledge, their own particular form of the transgression they were about to commit. They gathered, the ancient text says, on the summit of Mount Hermon, a mountain whose very name in Hebrew carries within it the root of the word for destruction, for devoted ruin, for the thing that has been consecrated to its own ending. It reads now like a prophecy, written into the landscape before the event it predicted had occurred. On that summit they made an oath. Not one of them would turn back alone. If this was transgression, and they knew it was transgression, the text does not allow them the defense of ignorance. It would be collective. If punishment came, they would face it together. And then, bound by their oath to each other and their desire for what they had no right to want, they descended. And the earth would never recover. Try to hold in your mind what this union produced. The ancient text is precise where we often wish it were vague. The Nephilim, the word itself rooted in the concept of falling, of that which has fallen, of that which causes others to fall, were born from the impossible merging of two natures that were never designed to combine. A celestial constitution and a human one, the divine and the mortal, fused together in flesh that was neither fully one nor fully the other. Hybrid in the deepest sense of the word, belonging completely to neither world. What emerged from this union was extraordinary. And what made it extraordinary was not, primarily, its monstrousness. That is the part we get wrong when we picture these creatures through the lens of modern mythology. We imagine grotesque things, distorted proportions, visible wrongness. A creature that announces its nature to the eye immediately. But the traditions are careful here, and what they describe is more complicated and more terrible. The Nephilim were, by the consistent testimony of the oldest sources, beautiful, not in a trivial sense, not merely tall and well-formed, but compelling in the way that a force of nature is compelling, the way a breaking wave carries beauty and lethality in the same motion, without separating them. The daughters of men found them irresistible, the ancient record says, and we must understand that this was not simply weakness or poor judgment on the part of the women involved. These beings carried within their physical constitution something that ordinary human men could not match and could not fully name: a gravitational pull, an intensity, a presence that registered in the human body before the human mind had time to process what it was encountering, and they were enormous. The traditions are consistent on this above all other physical details. The Nephilim were of extraordinary stature, not the cartoonish giants of later mythology, beings 60 feet tall throwing boulders like pebbles, but something more precisely terrifying. Ancient sources describe heights ranging from figures somewhat above 9 feet to measurements that modern readers tend to discount as exaggeration, while missing the point that even the conservative end of these estimates describes something no human population would encounter and not be permanently altered by the experience. Goliath of Gath, whose lineage the ancient scholars consistently connected to Nephilim stock that survived the flood in diminished form through later generations, stood at a height the text records as exceeding 9 feet. He was not exceptional among his own kind. He was a remnant, an echo, a shadow cast by something that had once been far larger and far more terrible than what faced Daoud on that valley floor centuries later. Picture the frame of such a creature moving across the pre-Diluvian landscape. Not the distorted proportions of a glandular disorder, not the fragile elongation that a genetic disease produces in human bodies, the structural weakness, the cardiovascular stress, the reduced lifespan. The ancient descriptions suggest beings of perfect proportion, scaled beyond anything the natural order generates. Shoulders like battlements, hands that could encircle a man's torso, a stride that covered ground in distances that required an ordinary man 3 steps to match. Their bones, described across traditions and corroborated by unusual skeletal remains discovered in various regions of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean over the past 2 centuries, were dense in ways that standard human biology does not produce. Their skulls, in multiple accounts, carried features that distinguished them from the human beings around them. Heavier, elongated in some traditions, bearing in the face something that communicated to ordinary men a signal of wrongness so fundamental that the body registered it before the mind. And their eyes. The texts that attempt to describe the eyes of the Nephilim are the ones that linger, that do not let go. Every culture that preserved these accounts, and there were many, because the memory of what walked the pre-Diluvian world was a trauma that human civilization carried in its bones across the flood and into every subsequent generation. Every culture struggled with the eyes. They were not wrong in the way that diseased eyes are wrong. They were wrong in the way that something seen in a dream is wrong, recognizably similar to what you know, and therefore far more disturbing than anything completely alien could ever be. They knew they were being looked at. That was what people said. You could feel it before they turned toward you. The sense of being assessed, categorized, found either useful or irrelevant. The gaze of a predator that has never needed to conceal its nature because nothing in its environment had ever threatened it. Because nothing had. The Nephilim were not merely large. The Nephilim were hungry. The Book of Enoch describes their appetite with an almost clinical precision that reads not like mythology but like testimony. In the earliest period following their birth, they consumed what the earth produced. They ate what the labor of human civilization generated: the grain, the livestock, the harvest of generations of agricultural work. Their size required what no individual family, no small settlement, no community of ordinary scale could sustain voluntarily. They moved through settlements the way a tide moves, not with malice exactly in those early years, but with an indifference to the sustainability of what they were consuming that amounted to the same thing. You do not argue with a creature that can remove the roof from your house with one hand. You do not withhold grain from a being that could walk through your fence posts like kindling. But their appetites continued to grow. When the produce of the earth was no longer sufficient, the ancient text says, they turned to the animals. They consumed the livestock until the herds were gone. And when the animals were exhausted, they turned to men. The Nephilim became cannibals, not as aberration, not as the desperate act of creatures pushed to an extreme, but as a continuation of the same hunger that had always driven them, now stripped of any remaining restraint. They were hybrids of two natures, and the celestial component had not sanctified the mortal one. It had amplified it. Every appetite that exists in human flesh was present in their constitution, expanded beyond what ordinary human bodies could generate, and freed from the social structures that human beings use to contain and redirect such drives. What ordinary men felt as desire, the Nephilim experienced as consuming need. What ordinary men felt as aggression, the Nephilim embodied as violence without ceiling. The earth filled with blood. That is not a poetic phrase. That is an accounting. The ancient record describes the pre-Diluvian world as saturated with what the Hebrew text calls Hamas, a word that carries within it the weight of brutal wrongdoing, lawless bloodshed, violence as a way of life, rather than a transgression within life. The world had not developed a violence problem. The world had become violence. The Nephilim had not corrupted a civilization. They had replaced it with something that wore civilization's shape, while consuming everything civilization required to survive. And the Watchers who had descended had brought with them gifts that accelerated the catastrophe. The ancient texts are meticulous on this point. Shemihaza taught the enchantments. Arachiel taught the reading of the earth's signs. Shamsiel revealed the secrets of the sun. The one the texts call Azael, whose name would echo across centuries into the desert rituals of the Yom Kippur covenant. A liturgical memory of blame placed precisely where blame belonged. Azael taught the pre-Diluvian world how to produce weapons. Swords, shields, breastplates of metal. The technology of organized killing made available to a civilization that had not yet developed the ethical architecture to contain it. He also taught the arts of physical enhancement and adornment, cosmetics, jewelry, the techniques of making one body irresistible to another, and in doing so accelerated the very cycle of desire and transgression that had brought the Watchers to Earth in the first place. Knowledge poured into a world before wisdom had caught up, power given before restraint had been developed to match it. The pattern is not limited to the ancient world, but in the ancient world, it reached its terminal conclusion with a speed and a totality that left the Creator no remaining options. Against the backdrop of this world of enormous, violent, beautiful, insatiable creatures, and the human civilization they had consumed, try to locate a single man. He was not a warrior. He was not a king. He commanded no army and held no fortress against the darkness outside it. He was, by any measurement, the pre-Diluvian world applied to human worth, unremarkable. Except for one thing. One thing the ancient text notes with a quietness that should be louder than it sounds when you read it. He walked with God. In a world where the divine image had been so thoroughly defaced, where the sacred architecture of what a human being was designed to be had been overwhelmed and overwritten by centuries of corruption, there was one man in whom that image remained intact. One bloodline the Nephilim had not been able to reach. One man who stood in the pre-Diluvian darkness like a single lamp in a room that had forgotten light existed. His name was Noah, and the task given to him was not explained in the terms of its full significance. He was not handed a theological treatise on divine justice. He was not shown the complete picture of what the waters would do or how long the world would be buried beneath them. He was given dimensions, materials, instructions for a structure of a size that in the context of the world around him marked him as either the most devoted man alive or the most deeply confused. In the culture built around and beneath the Nephilim, a culture in which nothing existed except the logic of power and consumption, there was very little distinction between the two. He built anyway, for years, for decades by some ancient reckonings. The ark rising above the plain, year by year, was itself a proclamation, a visible demonstration, for anyone with eyes to read it, that something was coming, that someone had been told, that the silence of God, which the pre-Diluvian world had mistaken for permission, was not permission but patience, was not absence but the extended hand of a creator who genuinely wanted what he had made to turn around. The Nephilim watched the construction. We do not know the words they used for what Noach was doing. The text does not preserve their contempt in direct quotation, but we know what a culture built on dominance does with a man who refuses to participate in it. We know what happens in every era, in every civilization shaped by the logic of power, to the one person who insists that power is not the final word. We can reconstruct it without being told. We can hear the dismissal across the millennia without needing it written down. They laughed at him. And above the pre-Diluvian world, the sky remained unbroken. What does it feel like to be the creator and look down at what you made? Architect, who processes the data of what his creation does and responds with calibrated, unemotional precision. But the ancient text will not give us this comfort. It uses a word that should stop every reader cold. A word that the scribes who preserved this text could have edited away and chose not to. A word that carries within it the entire weight of what it means to love something and watch it unmake itself. He was grieved in his heart. The Creator looked at the earth he had spoken into being from nothing. He looked at the Nephilim, at what the transgression of the Watchers had produced, at the way the sacred image in which human beings had been made was now buried beneath centuries of corruption and violence and hybrid distortion that had no remedy at the scale it had reached. He looked at a world that had been given every possibility, that had stood at the beginning of its history before every available direction, and had moved, consistently, in the one direction that led directly away from life. And something in him, something the text will not let us theologize into clinical distance, responded. This was not cold justice. This was the sorrow of a maker watching what he loves choose its own destruction. The decision, when it finally settled, was not the decision of an indifferent judge calculating outcomes. It was the decision of a creator who had extended what the ancient tradition calls long-suffering, a patience that did not signal uncertainty but love, that endured not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the possibility of repentance was always being held open. The pre-Diluvian world was not destroyed without warning. The ark rising on the plain was warning. The preaching was warning. The decades of visible preparation were warning. An invitation extended not once but across the entire construction period, visible to every creature with eyes in the region. The Nephilim saw it, and continued. The day the rain began, the pre-Diluvian world had no word for what it was seeing. This is not a small thing to sit with. There had been no rain before. The ancient record describes a world watered by the rising of the deep, springs, mist, the subterranean waters reaching up through the earth to irrigate the land from below. Water falling from the sky was outside the experiential vocabulary of every living creature on earth. When the first drops fell, there was no framework for it, no inherited understanding of what this meant or where it led. The sound it made on the leaves and the stone surfaces and the broad shoulders of the Nephilim was a sound no living ear had ever processed before. And then, it intensified. The text does not describe a rain. It describes the opening of the floodgates of the sky simultaneously with the breaking open of the great deep, the waters above and the waters below releasing together, as if the entire structure of the created order had been placed into reverse, the world being returned to the state before the second day of creation had organized it into sky and land and sea. The sky broke. The earth fractured, and the water came not in sheets but in walls, in columns, in pressures that the pre-Diluvian world had no engineering to address, because it had no reason to have anticipated the need. Picture what the Nephilim did in those first hours. They were not creatures familiar with fear. Beings of their size and constitution had dominated everything in their environment for as long as they or their immediate ancestors had existed. The natural world had always yielded to them. The human world had always organized itself around them, first in awe, then in service, then in paralyzed submission. Nothing in the pre-Diluvian world had ever threatened them on the scale they threatened everything else. And yet even a body of 10 feet, even bones dense as stone, muscles built for force that no human warrior could match, even hands that had uprooted trees and overturned stone walls. These things are nothing against a flood that has no ceiling. The Nephilim ran, as everything ran, to higher ground first, to the hills that had always stood above the plains they dominated, to the higher ridges where they could look down and watch the water spreading across the lowlands below, still perhaps believing that it would stop, that this was a storm, that the sky would close again, and the water would recede, and the world would return to the configuration they had always known. The water did not stop. It rose past the lowlands, past the hills, past the ridges. The ancient record gives the measure with precision, 15 cubits above the highest peaks. There was no elevation left. The world had been placed beneath water, and no strength, no size, no power inherited from a forbidden union between the celestial and the mortal could hold a body above a surface that no longer existed anywhere on earth. The Nephilim drowned, not in battle, not consumed by fire from the sky, not shattered by the direct force of divine anger expressed as violence meeting violence on equal terms. They drowned the way everything drowned, caught first by the rising water, then overwhelmed by it, then taken under by a force so total and so patient that their strength, which had never been opposed by anything equal to it, was simply irrelevant. The violence that had structured the pre-Diluvian world, the hunger that had consumed civilizations, the transgression that had defaced the divine image across centuries, all of it sank. All of it went down beneath water that had been held in reserve above the sky since the second day of creation, waiting for the exact moment when it would be needed. The world went silent. For 150 days, the surface of the earth was a single unbroken expanse of water, and within it was everything that the Nephilim had built, and everything they had destroyed, every fortress and every ruined settlement, every bone too large to have belonged to an ordinary man, every altar erected to appetites that had no name in the language of the sacred, every trace of the transgression that had brought 200 watchers down from wherever they had stood to make an oath on the summit of a mountain devoted to its own destruction. 150 days of erasure, and on the water, a boat. Inside it, one man who had walked with God in a world that had forgotten what walking with God looked like. One man who had spent years building something inexplicable in plain sight, while everything around him proceeded toward its ending. One man whose bloodline, by the mercy of the Creator who had looked down at what his creation had become and grieved, remained intact, uncorrupted, untouched by what the Watchers had introduced into the sacred architecture of human life. The world was rebuilt through him. Everything that came after, every civilization, every nation, every human being who has ever lived since the waters receded, came through the one man the Nephilim could not reach, came through the preserved line, came through the demonstrated faithfulness of a Creator who, in the middle of the most complete act of judgment the world has ever witnessed, remembered a man on a boat and caused the water to begin to fall. The Nephilim are why the flood happened. That is the part of this story that comfortable readings of the ancient text consistently omit. The flood is almost always taught as a story about human sin, about the general wickedness of men, the generic depravity of civilization. And human sin was present. But the specific catalyst the text identifies, the specific development that moved the Creator from patience to the decision that the world had to be erased and rebuilt, was not merely that human beings had been bad. It was that the image in which human beings had been made was being systematically destroyed. The Watchers had not simply introduced wickedness. They had introduced a corruption of the created order at the genetic level, a distortion of what humanity was designed to be at the most fundamental layer of its existence. The Nephilim were not just violent. They were walking evidence that the line between the Creator's design for human beings and the transgression of those who had defaced that design had been erased. That the world had accepted the corruption so completely that the corruption had become the world, and so the world had to be remade. There is a reason this story was not destroyed. Suppressed, yes, moved to the margins of theological conversation, explained away by interpretive traditions that often seemed, to careful readers, slightly too anxious for the urgency of their own reassurances, but not destroyed. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserved it. The oldest rabbinic literature engaged with it. The New Testament letters of Peter and Jude reference it with an assumed familiarity that suggests the earliest Christian communities did not consider it a peripheral curiosity, but a central piece of the theological architecture they were working within. It survived because it contains something that cannot be safely removed without collapsing the structure around it. It contains the answer to why the flood was not an overreaction. It contains the explanation for why a creator of infinite patience chose a specific moment in the history of the world to set a hard limit. It contains the evidence that evil is not merely a human preference, that at certain junctures in the history of the created order, it has had assistance from beyond the human. And it contains the counter-evidence, the one man who did not go along, the one line that was not corrupted, the one pair of lungs breathing inside a boat on a featureless ocean that carried within them the future of everything that came after. The question the Nephilim leave behind is not ultimately about what they looked like, their size, their appearance, the precise measurements of their corrupted physicality. These are details that the ancient tradition preserved, because the tradition understood that embodied creatures need embodied details to grasp the weight of embodied realities. You need to picture them to feel what it meant that they existed. You need to feel what it meant that they existed to understand what it cost to remove them. But the question they leave behind is this: in your own era, in the particular darkness of the world you inhabit, what is being done to the sacred image? What is being corrupted, systematically and at scale, in the architecture of what human beings were designed to be? And is there, as there was in the days of Noah, one man or one woman who has decided that the answer to that question matters, who walks with God while the world around them proceeds in its chosen direction, and who builds, visibly and without apology, the thing they were told to build? The waters receded. The dove returned with a leaf in its beak, and the man on the boat wept, and the world began again.